Looks like we have everyone that had sent in their registration and everyone's accounted for. Still have one that's trying to join. I think they'll be connected here in just a minute. So a couple of things before we get too far into the program. This will be how it will work each evening. I've got a couple of Master Gardeners this evening, and we'll have some Master Gardeners during each of the sessions that will be monitoring the chat. And if you have a question, maybe just put it in the chat. They may be able to answer the question, or they can interrupt me to ask that question. I think that would make it a little easier than everyone trying to unmute their mics at the same time. So in this case, we'll only have a couple of folks that would be coming in at the same time. I'll keep chat open as well and monitor it throughout as I cover tonight's introduction. I'm also going to have a couple of places along the way where we'll pause, and I will open it up then. So I'm going to give you a chance to unmute as well and ask questions. So if I don't make myself clear on a point or you need more clarification, then would be the time to probably ask the question. If you've got something else or to ask related to the topic, then you can ask during the Q&A session or put it in chat and we'll address it at the appropriate time. One of the good things about chat is if you don't need your question answered right then, you can type it in. And when we do pause, you don't have to try to remember exactly what it was you were going to ask 5 minutes ago. So we can go back and pick up. One of the first things I want to do is there's several on tonight that may not be familiar with the University of Tennessee Extension and what the program is, as well as the Master Gardening program. So I want to take just a minute and introduce you to the University of Tennessee Extension and what we have to offer, and then we'll get into the class topic. But we are a part of the land-grant university system, and the UT became a land grant in 1867, a part of the 1862 Act. In 1890, a second university in Tennessee was added, Tennessee State University. In 1887, the research arm of the land grant system was added. This is a series of research farms located across Tennessee, and every state actually has research facilities to conduct practical research on the farm. And in 1914, they added a cooperative extension, which is the outreach, bring the research and teaching to the people who would actually be using that information in their communities. So it's the University of Tennessee Institute of Agriculture, which is the overshadowing body of the land grant system with the UT. That has therefore a teaching arm, which is the College of Agriculture, an outreach, which is extension, and then the agri research centers to conduct research. We have departments in several areas related to agriculture. Those would probably be of interest to you is the plant science and the biosystems and soil science. We have the ability to, of course, conduct research that includes horticulture, but also to find solutions to problems, as we'll discuss as we go through this. There is an office in every county, and we've got folks from about 3 or 4 different counties that have signed up for this. So there is one in your county and an agent there who would be able to help you and to answer your questions. So one of the unique things about Extension's role is the outreach that we do, the programs such as the one we're conducting tonight, as well as others. But we also help conduct research. As a part of the research component, once they have done the field trials on the research stations, they often take those trials out to farms across the state. And Extension helps with those programs as well. So this is my contact information for those of you in Sequatchie County. And you can easily find the contacts for your county by simply going online and Googling your county. We do programs in areas other than just agriculture. We have a large youth development program focusing, in our case, in Sequatchie County, teamwork and workforce preparation, as well as communication skills. We have the production ag, as well as horticulture and natural resources for our agriculture programs. And we have several things that you might avail yourself to. We'll talk more about soil testing when we cover soils in the next meeting. But pest ID, if you've got a problem in your garden, your agent in your county is probably the first person you might want to contact. If they can't answer your question, they know people who can help and answer questions. And we also have a family and consumer science program covering family, food, health, home, and finance. So there's several parts to the UT extension, and you're only seeing a part of it with the gardening. We realize we're here as a resource, and we can answer a lot of questions in a lot of different areas. So a couple of things that we have planned in Sequatchie County. And actually, the first one I want to mention, actually both of the ones I want to mention right now, are programs being conducted by the Sequatchie Valley Master Gardeners in the UT Extension offices in Bledsoe and Sequatchie County. In 2 Saturdays in March, we are planning what we call Soil Test Saturdays. From 9 to noon on the 13th of March, we will be at the Farmers Market, which is in the middle of Pikeville at the courthouse. And we are going to be there to assist in soil samples. So you'll need to bring us enough sample to fill one of our boxes, and we'll help with the paperwork in facilitating the sending of the samples to the lab. We're going to repeat the program in Sequatchie County on Saturday, March 20th from 9 until noon, and it will be at the UT Extension office, which is on Church Street. But if you're familiar with Dunlap, we're on the back side of the courthouse square. We just face the opposite direction of the courthouse. So those are 2 opportunities, particularly if you're planning on gardening, where you can get some help filling out soil test applications and forms and facilitating their being sent off. The cost per sample is going to be $20. And I said we'll cover soils in one of our later meetings, and we'll go into a lot more detail of how much soil you'll need to bring and how to prepare your sample at that session. And then the last session or program I wanted to mention is the Tennessee Tree Day. This is a program which is going on the weekend of March 19th and 20th, where the Tennessee Environmental Council is providing trees. They're $2, $3 a tree, maybe a little more than that, depending on the tree, that you can order. And there'll be pickup sites available in our area and across the state. So you can go to the address that's on the screen and see what trees they have available and choose where you want to pick up your trees. Now there's a site going to be in Pikeville on Friday the 19th, and a site here in Sequatchie County on March 20th. In fact, the site on March 20th is also going to be at the extension office with our soil test Saturday. So those are some things that's coming up that I thought might be of interest to this group. So let's get into the program. All right, we're going to be talking for the next little bit about some things you need to think about in planning your vegetable garden. And the whole series that we're going to look at over the next 6 weeks is the basics of vegetable gardening. And reviewing some of the notes, we don't have a lot of the sessions that says this is the vegetables you might need to consider planting. We certainly are going to be talking about some principles to consider and things to think about as you're planning your garden. So let me get my screen shared again. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about climate and some things to think about regarding weather and climate in your vegetable gardening. And then we'll talk about actually site selection and what you need to think about in placing your gardening where it needs to be. Now, one of the things about weather is it can affect all of us. And the notes say it's a constant topic because it affects all of us. And after the last 3 or 4 days, it's definitely been a topic a lot of people has been talking about. I don't know about all of you, but we kind of missed it where I am. There's absolutely nothing on the ground out there now. But I do know I've talked to 2 or 3 out on the mountains around the county and talked to some co-workers and folks in Middle Tennessee. And we got anywhere from a couple of inches to 4 or 5 inches. Some of it starting with an inch of ice. So, you know, the weather certainly does affect us, and it certainly can affect your garden and what you're planting. And where we are can make a big difference. And that's certainly noticeable in this last weather pattern that moved through in the last couple of days. So some areas were affected differently than others. So we'll start with a big picture. And one of the things to think about is exactly where we are on the earth. Now, this next slide points out that the sun hits the earth directly. The most affecting the area somewhere between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. And the tropical zone, of course, is the warmest and mildest climate. So how the light from the sun, the energy from the sun hits the earth can affect. And of course, the amount of energy that is coming to the earth decreases. You move toward the North Pole and toward the South Pole. So we're somewhere about halfway in between those. So we live in an area where we can have some extreme colds, but also be affected by some of the southerly flows and have some really warm weather. Of course, the seasons change for us, and we have 4 distinct seasons as the earth moves around the sun and its distance from the sun, and all affect the the seasons that we have. So we have a distinct spring, summer, winter, and fall. As you move further north, those seasons vary a little in their magnitude and how long they last. As you move a little further south toward the equator, a little more toward the warmer side of things instead of having distinct falls and winters. And what this really comes down to is the fact that we have a variety of weather. And this map shows the average daylight interval, or how much light actually shines on an area during a given season. And if you notice, we're kind of in the middle, that dark blue. There's areas that get more light even in January, February, and December in the winter months. And also areas that get less light because of where they are. This also affects our temperatures, our hardiness zones. And this map actually, I want to show one that's a little clearer here in just a second, shows the different hardiness zones. The USDA, based on where you are in your weather and climate pattern, has established these hardiness zones to help us figure out what plants can survive in our climate. So this one's a little more clear. If you notice, most of Tennessee is in a hardiness zone of 7. There are parts of the state in the extreme northeast corner that is in 6, and there's parts in the extreme southwest that are in 8. Well, what this means is that we can have temperatures down to 0. From 1976 to 2005, we averaged minimal temperatures were 0 to 10 degrees in this zone. There are some areas that are certainly seeing that last day or two, which means plants that are not winter hardy probably aren't going to do very well on those cold winters. But luckily, they're not every winter. So this map actually defines Tennessee in a little more detail, and it kind of breaks the zones down to a 7A and a 7B. And if you'll look at the area around Marion, Sequatchie, and Bledsoe, the higher elevations are in 7A, which is a little colder. And the valley itself, particularly Sequatchie and Marion County, is in 7B, tend to be a little warmer. And if you also look at this, you can see that the further north you go in the state and the further east you go in the extreme northeast corner, you move into those temperatures that can be well below zero. So, when you think about the cold and how cold it can get, then you need to be thinking about the crops that you can grow. Because we do have some distinct seasons and some fall weather that's not extremely cold, and we can have those cool season and warm season crops both. And the time of year that we plant those, the cool season is early spring and into early summer, and then late summer into the fall, and warm season through the spring and summer itself. And these cool season plants can tolerate some cooler temperatures, and some can even tolerate a light frost. Your warm season are not going to survive the cooler weather or the frost. And we're kind of in a place weather-wise or climate-wise where we can grow several crops, both in the cool season and warm season group. As we go through the next few weeks, we'll talk more about what crops fit into which category. But of course, spring frost can also be a problem. If you plant your tomatoes too early, then you need to be thinking about protecting them or timing your planting so that they don't get bit by the frost. The protection, it can work, but you got to do it right and be able to make sure that the plant is truly protected. And it's not always going to guarantee that it will work. Something else we think about as we're discussing climate is we have some hot summers, and you can get it very warm and humid in the summer. And just as cold weather can stress plants or damage plants, then plants can also suffer from heat stress. I'll go back one. If you'll notice, we're still in the same number heat zone, but it says we can have temperatures from 60 to 90 degrees on most days in those extremes. So we can actually get warmer than that in some parts of the state. So heat stress, is one of the climate problems that occurs. So we need to think about the plants and whether or not they can tolerate hot summers. So, very quickly, when you think about it, we've got cool season plants such as our brassicas, greens, and mustards. Potatoes are often planted early in the spring. We also have those plants which can tolerate hot conditions, really warm conditions, such as okra. There are also a few that, they're going to need those moderate temperatures. Tomatoes don't do really well in extremely cold, and they don't do really well in extreme heat. So we've got to think about when we plant and what plants we plant. Because this does affect the plant's development and its growth. So I want to pause here and ask if there's any questions. I went through the climate a little quickly because I think most of us are aware that temperature and heat and drought can can affect a plant. And I also need to be aware that where you are in elevation can affect the temperature, can affect the rainfall. So being observant of the conditions in your area. If you happen to live near a large body of water like a lake or have a large pond, it might be that could hold heat and change that area for a difference in microclimate. You know, even on the plateau, if you're in higher elevations, there's areas that might be under a hill or on the side of a hill that might not get as much frost as places on top of the hill. And cold air settles. So, you know, if you're planning to have a garden and you've got a choice between a higher elevation or in the bottom of the hill, then you might want to avoid where the cold air will settle into the bottom of the hill. So on the side of the hill might be better. Top of the hill might just be too windy. That maybe that's something else to think about. Any questions so far? Mm. Nope. Okay. So this, I think, is the part most of you are going to be thinking about, particularly in the next few weeks as you're planning your garden for this summer, and that is your site selection. And some things that you need to think about for your garden. How much space do you really need? How much sunlight does the area get? What are the soils like? You know, what are the human considerations? What is the time that you have to put into it? What equipment do you have? And think about all the different components that'll go into making your garden. You know, the thinking about, you know, where I happen to have some gardens, they're some of the best soils. It's too far away to really be accessible because you have to walk. So having it close at hand where you would actually be able to work or get access to the garden on a regular basis to find out what's going on. And actually, the screen's as big as it gets. So whoever was asking it asked. However, I think I could readjust. Hang on. Is that better? Yeah. Okay. That was my fault. My
It
screen
worked.
Yeah, mine looked fine. Didn't realize it wasn't exactly right for you. Okay, let's talk about space. And how much space do you really need? Well, it may depend on the crops that you're planning on growing, and it may also depend on your ultimate goal. Are you simply looking to have some fresh vegetables during the season and not really worried about having enough to store for winter? Are you thinking about growing plants, you know, that take up space? How big those plants can be? And here we have in this chart some estimated needs in pounds per person for fresh, and in the pounds per person if you plan to preserve. So, you know, for beans, you may need about 8 pounds of harvest. So you might need only a row. But if you are looking to put some up or preserve it, you may need 2 or 3 rows. Peppers, You might get by with a couple of 3 plants, or you may need twice that or even more if you plan to put them up. You know, potatoes, 50-pound to 100-pound of potatoes can provide you with potatoes during the season, but you'll need that many more for storage as well if you plan to keep some over the winter. Now, the important point here is that there is a wide range of consumption of the different crops in our diet. There's some things that we eat more of or would have more often than others. And sometimes it may be a challenge to grow enough potatoes in your garden to supply everybody in the family with potatoes every day, or to have potatoes throughout the winter. However, you know, if you know what you want to accomplish, then you can determine if you have the space and the resources to actually grow the crops that you want. Now, this is the same basic information from the last, but you know, it adds to it the row space that you need, or how much distance. So 8-foot row of bush beans would provide you with about 8 pounds. You know, peppers, you know, you're going to need a 20-foot row to really provide the yields that you need. Tomatoes, you know, you can see about 8 feet of row. Lettuce, about 17 feet. Potatoes, you want to need a lot of room for your potatoes. You want to grow enough potatoes to provide the 75 pounds of potatoes that's there for your needs. Squash, not quite as much. So the squash definitely, you know, you can, if they're doing well and everything's working, you know, you can have squash on just a handful of plants. So certainly don't take the space for squash than it would potatoes. So think about what you plan to grow in the space that you have, and whether or not it would be actually feasible for you to try to grow those plants. You know, you also want to think about the potential for production. So you want to be able to match your consumption with your production, and that is, you want to make sure that you're able to gather what's being produced. You certainly don't want anything to go to waste. And it takes time for you to grow, and takes a little effort and money. So you don't want anything to go to waste. So make sure you know that what you're producing is going to be utilized. It also says here to match production, you know, with your site. You know, think about what you can grow and what your site will produce, and match the plants that you grow and how much you would grow. So I guess the bottom line is, you know, it's better to have a small garden that will do well than a large garden that will be overrun with weeds and not well attended. And if you're just getting started in gardening, or I've talked to one or two of you that are new to the area, gardened before, they're not sure how it's all going to work in Tennessee, you know, you may want to start on the small side and then grow as you figure out how well things will grow, or what grows and what doesn't. But it's certainly better to err on the small side, at least initially, so that you can keep up with what needs to be done. So let's talk about how you're going to grow your plants. And there are a wide variety of ways in which plants can be grown, and you may have a combination of all of these in your garden or around your house. Certainly in the ground, it's the more traditional way of growing vegetables and gardening. Raised beds is another way in which one can produce vegetables And we're going to talk in detail about raised beds in one of the future classes. And they certainly have their place. Containers. If you don't have a lot of space, then you may consider container gardens and growing your vegetables in containers. And even some of the more common garden plants, such as peppers and tomatoes, there are varieties that are now being bred for small spaces in containers. So there's a lot of options out there. And like I said, you may decide that all of these may be something you would want to in your garden, depending on the plant and the variety of plants you're growing. So the in-ground plants, those that do well growing in the ground and not in raised bed containers, are typically your large plants. So, and your vining plants, those that traditionally take up a lot of space: corn, okra, squash, watermelons, and pumpkins. Also, those that have a long growing season, those that are going to have a long harvest period. Some of your tomatoes, okra is another one of those that has a long duration that you can harvest off of. And those will take a larger space and often do better directly in the ground. Also, space, if you eat something or prefer to have something every meal, then you're going to need the space to grow it. Or if you're planning on preserving tomatoes or peppers or put up corn, then you're also going to need to think about more space for those crops. And then crops such as corn in particular, being wind pollinated, they're going to need to be planted in a block, and they're going to take up space in that block so that the corn can be pollinated and produce properly. When you look at this, winter squash, for example, is another plant that you may need to think about the space it's going to take up, because it takes a long time for the plant to grow and the squash to actually develop. And the space that it's using is going to be tied up with that crop throughout the season. So just thinking about how long plants will grow and develop, thinking about how much space they take, both in height and spreading out if they're vining when you're planting your crop. Then you've got the plants that may not take up a lot of space, that are going to be really small area that doesn't need a lot of plants to provide your needs. Plants that are short duration in from the time they're planted to the time that they are harvested, so that you can come back and plant again. And the plants here, these are plants that don't take a lot of space. They lettuce, maybe an excellent example. Radishes, beets. There's some varieties of beans that may not necessarily take a lot of space or take up time in the space. Peppers and tomatoes work really well in some of the smaller spaces. And you can produce a lot of fruit in a little space with those. Herbs is listed here. They're not something you use in a large quantity, so they are going to be kept in a fairly small area in the garden, or even in raised beds or containers. In section 6, when we talk about small-scale gardening in raised beds, we'll go into a little more detail about how to utilize the space. All right, where does your garden need to be? It doesn't matter whether you're thinking about raised beds or traditional in-ground, for that matter, even containers. There's some things you're going to need to be thinking about. Some general questions you're going to need to ask yourself. What is the condition of the soil? How much sunlight does the site receive? What has the site been used for in the past? And then depending on your neighborhood, there may be some restrictions on your gardening or on how you utilize the space that you have in your yard. So those are questions you're going to need to be asking yourself.
Sheldon,
Yes.
we've got a question about whether or not this PowerPoint can be emailed so that they can have this information later. Is that possible?
It is possible. There's also a publication that the university has developed that covers this same topic, not in PowerPoint form, but more in a little booklet form that I was going to provide the link to at the end of the session. So I can provide the PowerPoint as well as the reference material. So that they'll both will be available. You know, in a perfect world, we would find a place that has sun all day long, that's very accessible. You don't have to walk up the hill or down the hill. It's right there where you need it. It's level. It's easy to work. And when you think about it, you know, that's not always the case. If you're choosing a site, you're going to need an area that gets anywhere from 6 to 8 hours of sunlight a day. You know, there's some crops such as leaf lettuce and spinach that can tolerate a little less sunlight, but the majority of our garden crops are going to need at least 6 hours and preferably 8 hours of sunlight. And this can also be a difference between whether it's morning or afternoon sunlight. You know, the morning sun is a little lower in intensity, and a few hours of morning sunlight may not provide all the light that the plant needs. So it would also vary, you know, as to what time of day the light actually is shining on it. Then again, there's a lot of crops that's not going to tolerate that late, hot, direct sun in the afternoon. So, you know, think about how long you get sunlight on the area. Is it all day long? Is it in the morning? Is it in the afternoon? You know, when you think about accessibility, you know, those gardens that are out of sight are often out of mind. So this needs to be a site that's easy for you to see and to visit. Something you can, you know, you may not necessarily work in it every day, but you might want to look at it every day. Make sure everything's growing. There's no weeds, no pest problems, that it's not drying out if it's turned dry and droughty in the summer. You know, walking through and pulling a weed once in a while is a lot easier than, you know, waiting a week and trying to get the mature weeds out of your garden. So your accessibility is very important. Another thing to think about with accessibility is when you start harvesting, you know, and carrying the produce out of the garden. If you grow really large pumpkins and watermelons, you may not want to carry them too far. Or you may want to have access to, so you can haul them out and not necessarily have to carry them out. Slope is also something you may want to think about. If it's sloping, that's not a problem, but you don't want a slope that's too steep. Because you get it too steep, then they'll erode, the rain will run off very quickly, and they tend to be drier soils on the steeper slopes. So think about, you know, where it is on the landscape. Something else to think about on the in the area is size. How big of an area do you actually have to work with? And as I noted earlier, you may want to start small and grow, but do you have the space to actually grow if you plan to grow in size in the future? So, think about the size of the area that you're working with. And this last one says air movement. It's a good idea to have air movement through the site. Certainly don't want it to be on, as I said, on top of the hill where it's going to be the windiest and your corn blows over. Air movement can dry plants out. It can help reduce diseases, but too much wind can also cause water loss in the plant and heat stress and drought stress in the summer. Something else to think about with the air movement is there anything that may be blocking air movement? So if you have a line of trees downwind of your garden site, you may actually have a place where frost will form. It creates a little frost pocket because the air movement keeps the frost from forming. But once you block it or stop the airflow, then frost may form on the leeward side much quicker than where the air is moving. So buildings, barns, houses, even a tree line can affect the airflow and the air movement and cause problems, or may be beneficial if it's laid out right. Just think about what's around your plants and what things may be going on outside of the garden itself. Things you may also want to consider with your site is, am I going to need to fence it? There are going to be things around that might want to be in my garden as much as I do. So, you may need to fence to keep deer and raccoon and other pests out. And deer and raccoon, neither one are that easy to absolutely fence out. And a 2-layer fence can be very helpful with deer. A low electric fence can keep out groundhogs and raccoons. The thinking about what may be in your garden or wanting to visit your garden is something to think about from the very beginning. Because it's much harder to get the animals out once they discover your garden than it is to keep them out from the very beginning. So as you're planning your garden site, think about the possibility that you may need to do a little fencing. And there is some publications that can go into some details, but a 2-layer fence for the deer is just simply a fence that is 2 strips, two fences actually, far enough apart that the deer are not likely to want to jump over that space, or it's going to have to be tall enough for them to not go over. And deer can jump pretty high, so you would have to have an awfully tall fence. But it's not that difficult to determine from the very start. The low electric fence, that works really well, just high enough off the ground that when the groundhog or the raccoon tries to go under it, they're going to come in contact with the electric fence. Fences will shock through a lot of grass going around it, but you also want to need to maintain that fence. The less debris or grass or weeds is growing up in that electric fence, the better off you want to be and the better the fence is going to work. So this adds a level of maintenance that you may need to think about in planning your garden. Some of the deterrents that you can put out, there's things that you can buy online or various stores that's supposed to deter deer or other animals from being in your garden. Those, in some cases, may work, but a lot of them are based on scent. So a really good rainstorm or a day or two of rain, and that scent may be washed away and you have to start over again. So, think about other critters that will be in your garden. Now, let's talk about soils. Now, in the real world, we want a soil that's going to be very easy to work. It's going to be well drained, something that doesn't crust over when it rains. It's going to allow water to move into the soil very quickly. You want it deep, and by deep we mean 36 inches in depth or more. We want soils that are going to be fertile. And then the sandy loam is a description of a soil type, which it lists here is ideal. This is a soil that if you pick up and it's wet, you squeeze it in your hand, it might form a little ball, but as soon as you take the pressure off, it kind of collapses. When it's dry, it's certainly not going to hold together. It's not going to be like sand that just continually moves even when wet, or clay, which balls up in a hard ball, and then when it's dry, it's an even harder ball. So this is a nice loose soil. And that would be absolutely perfect. But most of us probably don't have that. If you're on the plateau, you're going to have soils that can range anywhere from bare rock to the 36 inches in depth that I mentioned. If you're in the valley, you're going to have soils that are going to be high in clay, so they're not going to be easily workable. You know, you're going to have soils that have been disturbed, or soils that have been compacted, have had a lot of traffic on them. So you can run into a lot of problems in cases with those soils. So here's some things to think about. Soils that are compacted can be difficult to dig. So, you know, if you find it easy to dig, even clay soils, they may not be easy to dig in relative terms, but you can dig them without a lot of difficulty. So if a shovel will go in, chances are plant roots will find their way into those into that soil and find their way through the space in the soils. We're going to go in depth in soils in the next one, but you certainly want to think about, you know, the soil and how easy it is to work. And when you look at a site that you have, you might want to think about the current vegetation that is on your site. You know, is it currently growing grass? And is that grass turf grass or turf type grass? So it's been a yard. Is it a weedy area? You may also want to think about the type of plants that are growing. Now, if it's a area that is growing grass, and it's, for example, Dallas grass, then it may indicate compaction or droughty conditions, soil that stays fairly dry. If it's a nut sedge, which nut sedges are plants with a look like grass, but they have a square stem and very stiff leaves, they often indicate poor soils, oftentimes poorly drained soils. So the plants that are growing on the site may give you some indication. Now, you may hear some farmers in the area say that if it's got sage grass growing, it needs lime. Well, sage grass will grow in a variety of soil types, but it does really well in soils where the crops that we would like to have, don't grow. So if you've got sage grass growing, then there may be a pH problem. There may be a problem with the phosphorus, potassium levels in the soil. And sage grass will grow really well under those conditions where the crop you want doesn't grow. So this is where having a good soil test with the nutrients in particular can help you. But as you're thinking about the plants, they can tell you a little bit about the conditions that you're growing in. The soil is often found in different layers or different horizons. The A horizon or topsoil, as most of us refer to it, is where we grow most of our plants, and it's what we would like to see in a garden. It's often well drained, but it also has a water holding capacity that can provide the plants with the water they need. It also is going to hold nutrients. But if you are living in a recently constructed area, an area where there's been recent construction, that topsoil may have been removed, and it's only the subsoil that you have left, which is what is referred to as the B horizon. And then typically in the Bledsoe, Sequatchie, Marion County area, the topsoil is going to be 4 to 6 inches, maybe a little deeper in some areas. Whereas, 8 inches at the most. Your subsoils can be several feet in depth. And knowing what you have, both as a subsoil and as a surface soil, can be important too. We often have some plants that will go a little deeper with their roots than the 6 or 8 inches of the topsoil. So we may need to also know what's going on in the subsoil, particularly if you're looking at fruit trees or long-term planting. So depending on what you want to grow, and we'll talk about this more in the soils itself, you may soil test only down 6 or 8 inches. You may need to soil test down 10 to 12 inches. But even if your topsoil has been removed, that doesn't mean it's all bad, because there are things that you can do. But you just need to analyze the area, think about the history of the area, and see what you have. Because you can quickly restore that topsoil level by adding organic matter and working with the soil and making sure the nutrient level is adequate based on a soil test. Something else you may think about is how quickly water moves in and through the soil. Garden plants will require good drainage. The one way it's often expressed is plants like water. Tomatoes in particular love water. They need quite a bit of water, but they do not like wet feet. So they do not like to stand in water. So they don't like the ground to be saturated. So one of the things you can do is when it's dry, not a day like today, dig a hole in the ground. Wet the area in the hole just a little, and then fill that hole with water, maybe a measured amount of water, and see how quickly it moves in and through the soil. If it is less than a half an inch per hour, then your soil is pretty drained. If it moves a half inch to an inch per hour, then it's moderately well drained. But if it drains down more than an inch per hour, then you have a well-drained soil. And even the heavy clay soils that we can find in the area can be well-drained soils if they have not been highly disturbed. So this is an easy thing to do and something you may want to consider if you don't know for sure how well the area is going to drain. Just dig a hole, pour it full of water, and measure how quickly the water drops. So, fill it and check it every hour. So what this means in more practical terms is, does the rain or irrigation actually soak in, or is it running off? Something else to think about is, does the water actually pool or stand in the site? So your poorly drained soil, so water is either going to run off or stay on the surface and not drain through the soil, both of which can be problems. So a site that's very well drained or well drained is going to soak up rain. Even a moderate rain event can provide plenty of water for the plants. They're not going to be spots in the area where the water collects or pools. It's going to evenly soak in across the site. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean the plants are getting all the water they need. That really depends on how much water is being added by the rain event. But it does mean that there is a better chance that the roots are going to have the space that they need. They're going to have good aeration. They're not going to be standing in water, and they're not going to have any issues related to staying wet. Of course, those areas where the water runs off very quickly because it doesn't soak in easily or quickly. Can also be areas where erosion can begin. And this would certainly be a problem if it continues. The soil, good soil is actually about half material, whether it be organic or inorganic, and about half empty space. And a good structured soil is going to provide that space for air and water and plant roots to be. Of course, if the area has had a lot of traffic or is in a soil that easily compacts, then you're going to smush those spaces and those particles of soil and organic matter closer together, decreasing the amount of air space and void space where the air and water moves through, which means the plant's going to be struggling to grow. There's not enough oxygen in the soil for the roots, and plants do use oxygen. They photosynthesize in the daylight, but they actually have to use the energy that they create through photosynthesis and store in sugar through respiration to grow. So when a plant uses the sugars that they've made through photosynthesis, they actually give off oxygen, and a lot of that happens underground. So a soil that is not well drained, a soil that doesn't have water moving through it, can be an indication of not only problems with your water, but also with the root space and with the plant's respiration and having oxygen. And organic matter, it actually matters. How much organic matter can be found in the soil? Organic matter can provide several things. One, it can improve water holding capacity, the ability of the soil to hold water for the plant roots to take up. Organic matter can provide nutrients, and it can also catch nutrients or hold nutrients. So when you apply a fertilized material, organic matter can help hold that in place until the plant actually needs it. Of course, organic matter can also improve the workability or the tilth of the soil. So organic matter, and how much organic matter is in the soil is important. Now, if you are amending your soil with organic matter, there's some things you might want to consider, and that's the source of the organic material. Does it have weed seed or other materials that you do not want? Is there any chemical residues from how it's been used prior? So there's several things to think about. The other things to think about when you're looking at your site. The other things around or in the soil that might interfere. Are there any construction debris or trash? Oftentimes, particularly if you're in a recent construction area, the builders may have had a small burn pile out back of the construction area where they tossed materials and burned it. If it was all wood, maybe it's not that big of a problem, but if they burned other things, that might cause problems. Even the area where there was a burn pile may have changed the soil's chemistry and the soil pH. Give you an example. I went to a house 2 or 3 years ago. They had a problem in a spot in the yard that just simply was not growing the grass like they wanted. And I wandered around for a few minutes scratching my head trying to figure out why the grass wouldn't grow until I realized they had a new block wall put around the yard. I got to asking, where did they dump the sand and where did they mix the cement? Right here on this spot. So all the the spilt sand that they didn't use, all the cement that got spilled changed the chemistry in the soil and the soil conditions in that area. And it just simply wasn't growing grass like the rest of the yard. So there could be things that happened in that area that you need to be aware of. Now, I also mentioned when we started, are there any restrictions in your neighborhood? Homeowner associations often have rules regarding gardens and how they can be used. So, think about the site and what's gone on before in that area. Of course, as you evaluate your site and you realize maybe there could be some issues, whether it be with soil or drainage, there's options that can solve those problems. And we're going to go into more detail about using raised beds. But a raised bed can often help you overcome some of the problems with soil and with areas that are not well drained. They can really make use of small space as well. So if you've got an area that's not very large, then raised beds can be a good way to get an intent or be more intensive in your production. If you got an area where you think it may be a problem with the soil warming up or drying out in time for you to plant, again, raised beds could probably help with that problem. So raised beds can be an option if you've got a lot of problems with your site. All right, something else that you may think about is how or the technique that you're going to be using in your garden, some of the practices you're going to follow. There's one concept of no-till gardening. And this is the idea that you're not going to be disturbing the soil very much. The problem though that you need to think about is the weeds and weed pressure that you may have in a site. Also, soil drainage and other factors may come into play as to whether or not tillage is something that you need to do or don't want to do. So the idea is with no tillage, not disturbing the soil and allowing the soil to develop a natural structure. And as the soil develops its natural structure, even in clay soils, they're going to be better drained soils. You're also going to have a larger population of organisms in your soil, microbes and earthworms and other things, most of which are going to be beneficial. But as you think about this, as I said, a lot of reasons people till is to get rid of weeds. So you're going to have a good weed management practice. There's also something called lasagna gardening or sheet mulching. This could be a good place to begin if you have a soil that's in relatively poor quality. The topsoil's been stripped off, or you have some drainage issues that may be of concern. The concept is to compost in place by layering your brown and green materials, and we'll go into a lot more detail on compost in another session. But you do it right on site where you want your garden to be. So something such as shredded cardboard, sawdust, shredded paper are laid down like the noodles in a lasagna. And the sauce would be those things such as kitchen waste and grass clippings that are the greens. And you layer it and allow it to compost in place, adding organic matter to the soil. And this is actually a practice that would be very easy to do and very quickly add organic matter to your soil. However, you need to be careful about thinking about this. This idea of layering noodles and sauce may not necessarily be all that necessary. Cardboard can block weeds. It can also prevent air and water movement through the soil. So it can also reduce the movement of earthworms when it's still in fairly large pieces. So, you know, if you're going to layer your garden, you may want to have smaller materials, shredded cardboard, as I said a few minutes ago. Now, if you decide to use wood chips, and this could be limbs and branches that you've chopped up, found around the yard, and they work very well. So as you layer your lasagna garden, you need about 10 to 12 inches of material. This will enable water and air movement, but not, not be overwhelming. And that deep will also block weed growth. And there is a, there's a link I've got here that I will send with the reference material. It goes into detail on the process of lasagna gardening. So, if you got a soil that needs improving, that's something to think about. Let's talk about people and equipment. When we consider the people aspect, we need to think about the time needed to manage the site. How much time can you devote to the garden? And how big of a space do you have? How much time it will take? How accessible is it? How easy can you get the equipment that you need to the site? You also want to think about, particularly, how easy will it be to get water to the site? What's your closest source? Is it a good source of water? You're going to have enough water to do the job. You're going to have to stretch a water hose a long way around the yard to get water to your site. So think about watering, your water source, and how you can water your garden in the summer without a lot of effort. Some other things you might need to think about. You might want to know where things are related to electric and water, gas, phone, and cables. And this is both overhead and buried, particularly buried. You're going to do a lot of tillage and digging in that area, and you might want to really think about what is found underground. But the overhead utilities may also be something to think about. The overhead electric wires and phone lines coming in. Because if you are planning on having fruit trees, large fruit trees, then you will need to pick a site where they will not be a problem with utilities. If you got any questions, there is the 811 number that you can call, and they can help locate, particularly underground utilities. And that may be something you may want to do, particularly in subdivisions where you're not familiar with a property and what may be underground. But the idea is to think about what's on the site, above the site, and underground with the site. Some things you may want to think about or may need to consider purchasing if you don't already have it is tillage equipment. And do you need a powered rotiller, or would a good hoe and shovel work? What kind of irrigation equipment do you need? You need bed materials. If you're building raised beds, do you have the materials to actually build the raised beds out of? So you need to be thinking about the expense in equipment and the materials that you may need. Some other things to think about. Are you going to buy your transplants, or are you going to start them and grow them from seed yourself? You can grow your transplants yourself, but it will take a little bit of time. It will take a little bit of attention on your part. And it may require more equipment on your part, lights and containers. Or you can simply find a good source for your transplants. So if you're going to buy them, the problem is, am I going to be able to find quality transplants that are in good condition when I purchase them? Site preparation. It's going to take a little bit of time to till if you're planning on or needing to till the site. It may take a little time to turn in cover crops if you are growing cover crops. If when you begin to plant, lay out your rows and lay out the area where you're going to be planting, that takes time as well. So, think about how much time will you need to prepare your site and how much time you will need before seed even go in the ground. Irrigation and watering can be a very time consuming, particularly if you are doing it by hand, even in a small garden. So think about ways in which you can easily water your garden and provide the water that is needed by the plants. And if you put in a little time and expense in an irrigation system, it could in the end save you some time and effort. So that may be something to think about. Of course, the one part of gardening that everybody loves is the weeding. So, you're going to spend some time weeding, but you also can take some time to mulch the crop, mulch the space between the rows, and try to put a barrier between, down to keep the weeds from being a problem. And as I said, taking a little time to pull a little weed is a lot better than trying to remove a mature weed out of your garden. So think about how much time and effort you will need in keeping the weeds at bay. You're also going to need to take time every once in a while to scout the plants for problems. Do you see insects eating? And if you have a tomato hornworm and you don't check for a day or two, you may not have a tomato plant. So you may want to, think about how much time do I have to scout for problems, and then to actually deal with that problem. It may take time to address the problem if it does occur. Once your garden starts producing, do you have the time to actually harvest? In a lot of cases, you're going to be picking something every day and finding things in your garden every day that needs to be harvested. So it will take a little time each day to walk through the garden, to look for the weeds, to look for the pests, and to pick that which is ready to harvest. And you also need to be thinking about how much time it's going to take to freeze, can, dry, or preserve the food that you're going to be putting up. All of which may be well worth the effort, but it does take time to do this. So the real question is, what do I need to grow? Well, there's three things to think about. One, what would I want to grow in my garden? What would I like to have fresh from a garden to eat? What would I like to put up to have to eat during the winter? So your preferences. How much of this do I actually need to supply the family or to supply the food that you need? And then the other thing, what will my site grow? I'd really like to have potatoes during the summer, but the garden site really doesn't grow potatoes very well. So, then got to find another source of potatoes. So you need to think about those three things. What do I like? What do I need and how much of it? And will my site actually grow this? And once those three things come together, then you should be able to grow what you want and need. So some things to think about. You know, he says don't just go to the garden center and buy plants and seeds. You need to, think about the source. I was talking to somebody earlier today, they'd been to a seed swap. So your neighbors, what they grow and what they've been successful at might be a good source of seed for you to think about if they're willing to share. There's other sources of materials from garden catalogs. But as you're preparing or planning your purchases, think about the hardiness zones that we talked about to start with, and your site conditions and whether or not that plant will actually grow. And the other thing to think about in all this is how much do you really want to grow? Why do you want to grow it? And what is my site like? What am I able to grow? If you're not that experienced in gardening, or at least not that experienced in Tennessee, start small and grow from there. You can branch out and experiment as you grow in your ability, and as you learn how the site that you are growing your garden in will actually produce. So those are some things to think about. So, questions? I am going to unshare my screen. We've got plenty of time allotted, so feel free to unmute, scroll through here. Yes, I will get the PowerPoints and other reference materials. Somebody suggests, planting corn and beans every 2 weeks to stagger your harvest. And one of the topics we are going to have in this series is how to extend your harvest in your gardening season. So some of these little tricks are going to be discussed. That is, every couple of weeks, and depending on the weather, that may not always work, because sometimes the 2-week interval, the plants catch up. If it's been a little on the cool side for corn in particular, that first planting will be slow growing, and in the second one in warmer weather can catch up with the first one. So it depends on how early in the season you start doing that. When it comes to soil testing, those 2 Saturdays are just days that there are going to be people available on those soil test Saturdays to actually help you figure out how to fill out the forms. So we're going to ask you to bring about 1.5 quarts of soil to us that day. We can help with the packaging and with answering the questions that are on the forms that go in with the soil test. Help you figure out what you need to ask for in recommendations. But as far as actually conducting the soil, other than those Saturdays, every extension office has the soil test kits and can get you the information on how to collect a soil test and how to submit it for analysis. And one of the things that's really good about the way the system in UT works is that if you submit it through the UT lab, it takes them about 1.5 weeks from the time it's mailed, dropped in the mail, to the time you get your answer back in the mail. The agent in your county will have access to those results. And if you're not in Sequatchie County and you call me, I could probably find the results for you. So we can, over the phone, answer your questions about your soil test, because we can get access to those results. And his lasagna garden is not in necessarily in raised beds. It's just layered on the ground in the area where you need to increase organic matter in your soil. It would probably work in a raised bed as well. I will send a link that is part of the notes for this this program that talks a little bit more detail about the lasagna garden. The idea is really just composting on the site where you would apply the compost eventually. So you're just creating a compost pile in the middle of your garden where you're going to be gardening in the future, and layering it in such a way that you won't have to spread it out as much as you would a big 3-foot pile. But I will send out that link on the lasagna garden method. You all can unmute at this point if you want to ask questions. You don't necessarily have to be typing them in. Railroad ties. Railroad ties are typically creosote, and that material can leach into the raised bed and the soils in your garden. So they're not recommended as material for building a raised bed. Treated lumber is typically not recommended as well because of the materials they use to treat. I think some of the more recent materials are a little safer than some of the older materials that are used, but still, they're probably not the best choice for building raised beds. See, removing ivy from an area. Ivy can be very prolific and rather invasive. One thing to do would be to, if you wanted to actually spray it with a herbicide. That would be the sure way of getting rid of it. But you may also, if you're not wanting to spray, you're going to need to continuously mow it and keep it cut back so that the roots are eventually sapped of their energy. But ivy can be a very, very hard plant to control. You want, I know who sent that based on the notes. I can send you a little more detail specifically about controlling ivy in an area. Smothering it, if it's an area, if it's an area where you can cover it with cardboard, thick layer of mulch, and just smother the ivy may also work.
Excuse me, the $25 fee, is that per person or is that per family?
I didn't catch all that.
The $25 fee for the class, is that per
Yeah,
person?
it just covers everybody on the connection.
Okay, thank you.
Speaking of which, I know there's just looking at pictures. If you do not have to send it to everyone, you can send it just to me. But if you'll just let me know how many people are with you on that connection, I can just see one name on the, or there's a couple of them that have 2 names listed. Just let me know. There's 2 or 3 of you I can see, but 2 or 3 of you that don't have your cameras on. So if there's more than one person at that location, just send a chat to me with the number of people or names, just so I can get a head count of how many people are on. We've got some guest speakers that's going to be a part of our group in the next, in some of the future sessions, and they was kind of wanting to know how many people to expect to be on. So this will help me answer that question. Any other questions? All right, next session, we are going to talk more details about soils. I'm also going to spend a little bit more time talking about the process of collecting a soil sample and how to send that soil sample off if you want to do that on your own. And if you want to wait for another couple of 3 weeks before for our soil test Saturdays and bring it to those events, you can do that. I'm guessing it's probably going to be a couple of weeks before it's dry enough and warm enough for anybody to want to go out and collect soil samples. So you know, that's something that's we'll discuss in more detail next week. No questions from anybody? That's all I have for this evening. And appreciate you all joining me. And look forward to the session next week. I think I have been in touch with everyone by email. And those of you who are master gardeners, of course, already have your email. My email. So if you've got questions, feel free to send them to me. And as I said, if you're in another county besides Sequatchie County, there is an agent in your county that can help you as well as I can. And if you need to know who that is or how to contact them, let me know, and I'll get you that information as well. But if you got any questions, I'll be on for a few more minutes and can answer those. But again, thank you all, and see you all next week.
Thank you very much, Sheldon. I enjoyed it. See you
Thanks,
next week.
See ya.